Welcome to the Land Use Committee meeting on how about July 16, 2013. See that only that one of our members is missing, but we do have a quorum, so welcome everybody and welcome to those on channel 16. Could I have a motion to approve the minutes of May 21st, 2013?
So moved.
Second.
Good. Are there all in favor? Say aye.
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 Opposed? The motion carries. Today we have a number of things on our agenda, including some information about our tax incremental financing, an update on that and how it's being used, and we'll look forward to having Darren Smith talk to us about that, and then some information again about possible situation we have with deer feeding and some deer, the increase in the deer population in southern Sioux Falls especially, and then also in northeastern Sioux Falls. So let's get started with the TIF update with Brent O'Neill and Darren Smith.
All right. Well, good afternoon. Darren Smith, Director of Community Development, and with me is Brent O'Neill, our Manager in Economic Development Division. So Brent and I will be doing a bit of a tag team here with the presentation and then answering any questions you have. We do have a PowerPoint presentation overhead, but certainly intend for this to be brief and informal. Really, the reason we're here is to provide an update on some changes that we would like to make to the tax increment finance or TIF district process. I think each of you are familiar with the fact that over the last over the last 3 years, there's no question there's been more TIF activity than at any time in the history in the city. Over the last 3 years, the City Council and the city has approved 9 new TIF districts. And in the 20 years prior to that TIF districts were utilized in Sioux Falls, the city councils collectively had approved 9 over a 20-year period. We've done 9 in 3 years, and that's for a variety of reasons. At the same time, because of the significant increase in activity, there's become a greater discussion, I think, about tax increment financing and what it is and how we do it and why do we do it and in what situations. And I certainly wouldn't try to convince myself or anyone else that this has been a community-wide discussion. I think the vast majority of people don't probably know what TIF is or even care what it is. But for those who are directly impacted, the City of Sioux Falls, the school district, and the county, well, there has been plenty of discussion at that level. Questions, concerns, maybe even a bit of criticism in terms of the level of activity and how we're doing this in the process and so forth. So we really wanted to dive into that and look at how could we make the process better. And that's what we're here to report today, with some things that we plan to move forward with and then something we'd like to move forward with that will require council action. So with this slide here, to give you a sense of who we've been talking to and meeting with and listening to over the past, I would say 15 to 18 months, I would start with an open work session we had with the City Council back in January 2012. I'm sure some of you will remember that. We were in the room next door and had a good close to 2-hour discussion back and forth, lots of good questions and answers. Over the last year and a half, there have been some TIF districts we brought to the City Council for your consideration and approval, and we've had good discussions at those times, and I think, again, listened along the way for how those processes maybe could have been better. Planning Commission meetings, we have probably heard the most feedback on the process from the Planning Commission and Minnehaha County and the county commissioners in particular. So we've really focused on them over the last year or so, meeting with them, educating them, frankly, on exactly what TIF is and what it is not. There are a lot of strongly held misperceptions about TIF. I think we made a lot of good progress with that, and then asking them what they would like to see in terms of the process, how it could be better, more informational, more timely. So we've met with each of the Planning Commission members one-on-one or in small groups and educated them, listened to them, answered their questions. We did the same with Minnehaha County Commissioners. We invited each of the 5 commissioners to meet with us one-on-one or in small groups to do the same thing. We met with 3 county commissioners and then their key staff as well. One of the county commissioners declined, felt like he understood TIF well, and then one of the other county commissioners was unable to meet with us due to illness, so we still hope to maybe follow up with that commissioner. Sioux Falls School District feels like they have a very good understanding of TIF, and again did not need a meeting with the school board members, but we did meet with their finance director, Todd Veek, and had a good conversation with him and the impact of the school district and so forth. We've talked to developers locally, primarily those who have utilized TIF in the past. We still plan to have more conversations with those in the development community going forward, but we've got a sense from them too of what they think works and what they think could work better. Legal experts, it's everything from our in-house city attorney staff to the attorneys that we use. We do use independent private attorneys to assist us through the process with TIFs and the legal aspects. Davenport Evans has been the primary law firm we've utilized, so Doug Hyack and Brendan Riley, but also Todd Meyer Henry and others in town who are very, very familiar with TIF, the statutes and the process, gotten feedback from them. And then finally, we've also looked at other communities. You know, how do other communities utilize TIF and what does their process look like? So then going to the next slide, and then after this I'll hand things over to Brent to go into a little more detail. Really, these 3 bullet points capture in a nutshell what we're moving forward with and proposing to move forward with. The first bullet point, just better communication, and this is something that I know the Planning Commission in particular is very excited about and looking forward to, but also the County Commission and probably the school district as well. And again, I'll let Brent go into a little more detail, but suffice to say we will be providing communication earlier on in the process to each of those parties impacted, again, from the Planning Commission to the City Council, the school district, and the county. Secondly, adding clarity to the process for staff, officials, and the private sector, again, by giving the process more structure, it'll make it more clear the timelines that are involved. And also, Councilor Rolfing actually, at a meeting quite some time ago, had asked for some kind of document that can give a little information to the council and others on these TIF requests we get. What types of requests should we be approving? And so we can't give you a document that tells you which ones you should approve and which ones you shouldn't. That's your decision always. But what we have come up with is a document we're referring to as guiding principles with TIF that we will provide you, the Planning Commission, and others, and it does share with you those things that we see as being TIF-worthy projects going forward, broadly or in general, because each project is, the details are different, the specifics are different, but we will provide that. And then finally, the item that will require council action to formalize the process, we are proposing that we have a formal application process. Now that means nothing more than a fairly simple one-page or one-page front and back application that a developer or the proposer of a project would fill out on the front end and file with our office. That would trigger some notification then to the Planning Commission, the City Council, and so forth. But there would also be an application fee associated with that, and it would be a modest fee, but it would help cover some of the costs that are associated, staff time, legal work, and so forth, on the front end, and also have the developers and those proposing projects have some skin in the game on the front end. We think that will help as well. So we'll go into each of these 3 bullet points in more detail, and Brent will begin with that right now.
Thanks, Darren. As Darren did mention, one of the key components that we wanted to improve upon was the communication. And in the past, I would say from the point that information about a TIF district proposal became part of the public domain is about a 5-week process between that point and the time it went to the City Council for approval. So we've tried to expand that schedule a little bit to give the council and others more time to work through that process. But two really important things, and actually you'll see up there in red, there are three things highlighted, which are really things that are new to our communication process. But one, we want to streamline and be consistent with our initial communication to the council. I think we have communicated pretty well in the past, but it may have varied in terms of the format we use. So we want to develop a consistent process there. So whenever we do get an application in, we're committing right away at that point to notify the council and then the planning commission as well through a memo that does highlight that the application did come in and just give you a rough parameter of what the request is for. A new item is it has only gone to the planning commission once. We're proposing taking it to the planning commission a second time. The first time just as an informational item to put it on their radar, to give them time to digest it, give them a month to think through the questions that they need or want to ask. We have currently been notifying the county and the school districts that are affected by this. We've had the planning commission hearing, but a new item, we want to take it to the city council twice as well. Give you guys that opportunity to hear and look through it, ask the right questions, give yourselves a chance to think through it through a week or 2 weeks before we come back a second time. So that would be another one of our objectives, in addition to that first notice, was to give the planning commission an extra hearing and give the city council an extra hearing, whether that's at a informational level or whether we take it forward kind of through an ordinance process and do a first and second reading. That does extend the process out 11 weeks, roughly. We don't really feel that changes the approval timeline. It's just that we bring information about the TIF to the council and others sooner, and we'd still work in the interim on some of the final details of a proposal. As we put together, a draft document on the guidelines, I think one of the things we were trying to do is just put in writing some of the things we already do. I mean, typically we are using TIF for blight issues as well as economic development issues. I think historically they've been a little bit more of the blight variety, dilapidated areas where there's environmental concerns or where demolition was needed. The economic development side will be a little bit newer, but we've seen a couple of those come through, those things like job creation, things that add to the fiscal health of the community, and so on. Things like financing of TIF costs, other than some older TIFs, TIF 5 actually being the most recent one that funded Sharapa Place. We've asked all TIF projects to be privately financed, by that meaning that the city's not expected to put cash in or issue its own bond, but that the developer or party receiving the TIF would have to secure their own funding. I put in parentheses up there preferred. I mean, I don't think we want to limit that outright if there was a special case where it made sense to everybody in the council, but generally that is going to be the direction that we give others, that it's going to have to be privately financed. Something we do put in there as well, but just want to clarify that the city can, reserve clawback provisions and other measures of performance just to make sure that developers and again other parties are living up to the spirit of any TIF proposal. And then again, for a matter of consistency, we've brought forward several plans in the last couple years. There's been some consistency between them and some inconsistency. In either case, they've always met the standards they need to meet, but we're trying to kind of corral that in and make sure we're bringing consistent documents forward so that you guys can rely on past experience and make apples to apples comparisons as you're moving forward on that process. Three important things as we review it and then actually as we take it to the council for your review and approval: demonstrated eligibility, demonstrated public benefit and interest, and demonstrated need. They kind of overlap, but they are distinct. Eligibility refers more to those minimum standards that they have to meet. Obviously, we're going to screen them against state law. We're not going to bring things forward that aren't conforming to state law. And then we're also going to look at that blight and economic development standard, which are really the two standards that you can justify using tax increment financing. Another important part, though, is as the participation by the city in a TIF district comes to fruition, making sure that there is a bona fide public benefit or a public interest. Again, that is somewhat subjective and can vary, but that includes things like job creation or special economic development, tourism, facilitating the improvements or the expansion of city facilities, partnerships at the public-private level, targeted industry recruitment, infill development. This is not an exhaustive list, but that's quite a few examples of the case where you could justify TIF being used in the public interest. And then probably one of the more critical pieces of the demonstrated need I'm not sure if you've heard of what's commonly referred to as the but-for test, but it's, saying, a project won't go forward but for TIF. And looking at the various projections, financials, and otherwise that show that TIF is indeed needed to make a project happen. So that's looking at kind of a bottom line basis on how TIF is needed. And then another aspect of that is just, what level of TIF is needed. We refer to that as the participation rate, how much of a TIF comprises the entire project. And, there are certain mathematical limits to where TIF is just not feasible, but I think there's also a point where you have to look at whether or not the contribution of a TIF is too high or too low to make it worth it. So that'd be another aspect that we'll bring forward in future TIF districts. And then something, again, we've been doing already but want to really reiterate and put in writing. We do a legal review. We do a fiscal impact analysis. We're evaluating the financial projections. We have not done market studies nearly as much, or if we have, we've kind of piggybacked off an existing market study. And verifying costs would be the 5 that we're listing here. Legally, we almost always go out to a third party, or we do always go out to a third party to get that independent review. We do the same, but not on a as frequent basis on some of the others. So that's just something that we want to take a more proactive approach to is verifying those various things with ourselves and, when needed, external parties that can give an independent eye and add extra expertise to that process. And then the last thing I want to talk about is the application process and the piece that Darren mentioned that we'd want to come back to the council for in terms of fees. We would ask to do a formal application. Right now, our application is more or less a written request from any proposer. They write a letter to us and spell out the terms of the project. We would create a standard application form, and like Darren said, it would be fairly simple, 1 page, maybe 2 pages at most, to really serve as a formal entry into the TIF application process. And then with that, we are going to require a summary, probably as an addendum, financial projections, timelines, all those things that go into a project like this. Darren did allude to the fees as well, and we're still kind of ironing out and vetting what the fees might look like, but a couple purposes of the fees are to, recover actual costs that the city have, both hard and soft costs. Soft costs being staff time and other internal costs. Hard costs being, that time we actually hire an attorney to do a review. So recovering some of those costs, as well as, serving as a kind of an entry into the process, making sure that projects are serious as they're coming in. And then a third component that we're looking at is, we do have to administer a TIF for several years. It can be relatively straightforward, but looking at whether or not we want to recover that as well. With that, I want to highlight just a couple next steps as we see it. We're here today with the Land Use Committee to give you this update on where we are, some of the things that we've heard, some of the things that we're documenting and putting into a formal process. We would like to do some additional vetting the next couple weeks. We'd have both a final draft of what our guidelines would look like, as well as an ordinance on how to implement that application process. And so by the end of August, we'd like to come forward with the ordinance on implementing the application and the fees. And at that point, we would have a guideline document, guiding principles document in final form to vet with the council as well. But then by the day after Labor Day, do a second reading on getting that fee in place. And then by October 1 or just a little bit earlier, we would have everything in place and effective. And one other point I'll just add here is that, one of the things that we've, I think internally, as we've discussed it, and occasionally when we've discussed it with others, really want to make sure we have this in place before we bring another TIF district forward. And not that there's one imminent or we know of one, but it's just something that we feel that we want to tackle this now and have it in place so that if and when that next district comes forward, that we're ready to implement this process fully and not overlapping them. With that, Darren and I are here for any questions you guys have.
Questions? Yes, Councilor Staggers.
Yes. On the sheet where it talks about improvement to communication process, you have down, upon application, notify Council and Planning Commission by a memorandum first week. And then you have a rather long period of time after the first week to the fourth week. I was wondering, is there maybe a possibility of just trying to shorten that up a little bit?
Sure. I can start by kind of explaining the rationale for that, and that is because we want to give the Planning Commission, so when they hear it as an informational item, we've got at least a 2-week period just to put it on their agenda from the proper notices that they need and the publications. So we were actually, in some ways, kind of doing the opposite and trying to make sure we were following all our processes and giving as much advance notice as possible.
Mm-hmm. Because then after that 4th week, then we have the Planning Commission holding their hearing at the 8th week. I suspect, once again, you're probably just trying to coordinate better with the Planning Commission, but I don't know, it just seems like it is maybe drawn out a little bit.
Yes, if I could add to that, I would say, and Brent, you jump in here too, I would say that the process you see in front of you is actually an expedited process compared to what we've been doing. Mm-hmm. Probably a concern I would have, even with this, between that 1st and 4th week, one of the things that takes place a great deal at the staff level behind the scenes that a lot of people don't understand is a lot of the discussions and the negotiations and back and forth with the city and the developer or the proposer of a project. And oftentimes it's, they might argue with this a bit, oftentimes we're waiting on them to determine certain things in their project as opposed to vice versa. So I would say this, I absolutely get what you're saying, and we want to be efficient. At the same time, we don't want to set arbitrary dates or be in a hurry just for the sake of being in a hurry, because these are typically large projects, and you're talking about public dollars in the form of assistance for projects, and they're usually 7-figure or 8-figure projects, and sometimes 7 or 8-figure TIFs. So we want to be deliberate and methodical, but yet we do want to be responsive and efficient. But I just add to that, one of the concerns / criticisms I think we have definitely heard from the Planning Commission in particular is that they do feel that this has been a rushed process, or it shows up on their doorstep 24 hours before they're asked to consider and take action. And that's really what we want to try and improve, because the reality is, and we've acknowledged this, that's not fair to them. So they will be more comfortable with a slightly more expanded process.
Thank you.
Do you have something? Go ahead.
Okay. I like what I'm seeing here, and I appreciate the fact that we're trying to, I guess, set up a policy for what we're doing with TIFs. And having a reason for, why do we want TIFs? I guess I'm searching for the word, but, just as a matter of policy for our city, why do we want a TIF? What's a TIF going to look like, et cetera? Where I'm confused is the need to have it as a part of an ordinance. Why, I understand the fee structure that would make it that way, but is there another reason why we'd have to have this as an ordinance?
That's literally the sole reason, is to get that fee in place. I think one of the things that we really wanted to present was something that maintains as much flexibility as
I don't see anything on the fee structure or anything here. It's kind of referenced, but has there more thought been put into it? What are we talking about? You talk about legal time from staff, you talk about your time. If you look at, in reality, how much time your office puts into working on a TIF, it's hundreds of hours. We could say it's, $10,000. What are we talking about for a fee here?
Yeah, well, like Darren said, it's probably going to be more of a modest fee, but we have talked about something in the $2,000 to $5,000 range as kind of a base fee. But we are also looking at making sure we've got some mechanism in place to recapture those legal fees on top of it, and or, if it takes an excessive amount of staff time. So one of the goals that we really want to make sure we're doing is being whole on our external costs. The costs where we're actually having to pay an external team to do some review, and really it is our goal to recover some of the costs of the staff time, but also making sure that part of our job is to be out there promoting, recruiting, et cetera.
Yeah, I would just add that more specifically, when a TIF goes through the process and is approved, we do typically recapture the legal expenses the city has in working with a firm like Davenport Evans. I mentioned that. we will recapture that typically through TIF reimbursement ourselves. Now, we're going to change that a bit and put us at the front end of that reimbursement and not the midpoint or back end sometimes. We'll be first in line before the project or right there with them. But really one of the primary reasons for the fee is sometimes a project will come in and it will be discussed and advanced, but if it doesn't ultimately come to fruition, we've still invested not only staff time, but more importantly, we've invested dollars with reaching out to our the legal expertise and having them review and give us guidance and direction on what we can and can't do and so forth. Well, if the TIF district is never approved and created and starts generating increment, then we have, those are costs that will not be recovered from the developer. And so that's one point in particular we look at, and we believe that it's really only fair that those costs are recovered, because yes, we're doing it as a public service for economic development and so forth, but at the same time, we're doing it on behalf of a private project.
Anything else? No. I have a number of things, as you might well expect, I guess. On that same timetable situation, might it be wise, I kind of like the idea, I like your ideas there of putting a timetable in it. However, I'm also concerned, as Councilor Stagger is, about the length of time. Might it be better to put a date in every month that says all this has to be for any TIF? You have to have it in by the 15th of the month, or when does the Planning Commission meet? What day of the month? Or what are they, the third? Or
they meet the first Wednesday of the month. And
first Wednesday of the month. So
I think
you might say they have to be in by, this has to be in by the third Wednesday of the month for the next month. See what I'm saying? And then you've got your week. Your week or two to get them notified and to kick this whole thing off, rather than saying there's 4 weeks, first week, 4 week, and then you can then they have a deadline, they have a date deadline, rather than you've got 12 times during the year that these are going to start, and because it literally that's what's going to happen anyway by the way you've got this thing set up. So just an idea for you there, that would speed it up.
We've got it noted.
Okay, and then the other thing on here was the fourth week to the 8th week, the notification, that there need to be 2 weeks between notification, the notification to the present to the Planning Commission as informational item. You're going to do an informational 1 week, and then 2 weeks later, hold a hearing with them?
Which item are you looking from the?
Present to the Planning Commission as informational 4th week, and then hold a Planning Commission hearing in the 8th week?
Yeah, and that was, like Darren alluded to, kind of a request of the Planning Commission that they get that second chance.
So you're going to hold a special meeting with them for TIFs, is basically what it amounts to.
It would be, for example, if one came in this month, we would take it to the August Planning Commission as an informational, and then September would be the month where we'd ask them to make the recommendation on it.
And maybe to make an analogy here.
So you're gonna wait give them a month to stew about it, but to.
Well, they only meet monthly.
Yeah.
And so I would compare it to a first and second reading. For the council with an ordinance. You get a first reading, then a second reading. The first reading is informational, setting a date of hearing for action at a second reading. That is essentially what this would be, but in the Planning Commission world. They only meet monthly.
Right.
And so really our best opportunity is to get to them a month before they're asked to take action. And it would be an informational item, and we would brief them. And there will still be things in those last 30 days that get tweaked and changed.
I agree that that's it. I was thinking that, they need to have a month, they need to have 2 meetings to do that. Did you have an addition there?
If you don't mind, if you're done.
No, I'm not, but I'll let you.
No, go ahead, finish, and then I'll.
No, okay. Then, just for information, what is infill development? Is that something to do with your teeth, or? No?
In this case, I think it's less painful.
Oh, okay.
But,
just for informational purposes.
yeah, infill development would typically be those redevelopment areas, kind of filling in the city versus expanding into the cornfield. So downtown,
Okay.
a lot of that would be considered infill
Okay, where
development.
something might be raised and then put back, some new put back in or something like that. Okay, just, I hadn't heard the term before, and I thought, better find out exactly what it is before I, yeah. Okay, cost of TIF. Okay, we had answered to that. I like to write questions as I do these. On the last page, your timeline, your next step, we've got present the landfill today, or land use, and then some additional vetting. Are you coming back to us on final proposal, or are you going straight to council on early August?
Yeah, I think our intention and our desire, in going into a little more detail today, the ordinance, I have to tell you, is going to be very brief. We're probably talking one page. We were hoping to go straight to council, and something that Brent had touched on is one of the promises, if you will, to the Planning Commission and some of those involved as we've gone through the process is that we would make every effort to have the new rules and process in place before another TIF would come in our door. We don't always know when one's going to show up, but when they do, they always want to go like crazy. And so, even going straight to the council, as you can see, it would still be early October before it'd be effective, and that's assuming, it's passed.
Are there any problems with that from any one of the committee members? Okay. I did have one other one. Why don't you go ahead?
I think my question was answered, and I guess probably what I'm looking at is, when this ordinance comes, is the ordinance going to address this timeline, or is it just going to be about is it going to be about policy, or is it going to be about fees?
I would say that it's going to be more about the ordinance will be about the fees. The guidelines is, again, really meant to be kind of a fluid document, but to try to bring consistency and some clarity so that, we're not going to cement that time frame in stone. We know that there'll be a time where some variation happens and we've got to push out. So it's meant to be kind of a gentleman's understanding that we will do our best to do the TIF in that time frame. And that commit to both the parties that have to decide as well as the developer on that.
And that's what I would prefer, because the way I imagine this conceptually, a developer comes to your office and says, hey, I got a great idea, but I need to talk to you guys because you have an idea of the bigger picture. So can we sit down over a cup of coffee and talk about this? And you nod or you shake your head after hearing it, and then they decide if they're going to go through with the process. So I think we'd get bogged down in the minutiae of having a policy that says 4 weeks, 6 weeks, 8, whatever. I wouldn't like that, I guess.
I couldn't agree more, and I'm glad you said that, because that's how they unfold typically. And that reminds me, one thing we talked about, I do want to stress is, by formalizing the process and giving it some structure, I do think that's a good idea and it's necessary with some limits. But we also want to make clear our door is always open for a developer or a proposer of a project to come in, have a cup of coffee, and talk about what may or may not fly. Because oftentimes with these, if you're not talking about Craig Lloyd or Dunham's, somebody who's done a number of these or been involved, there is an education process. We go through it all the time with people who ask us if they could get a TIF to do this or do that. And then we sit down and explain to them what state statute says and what is eligible, what's definitely not eligible, what's gray. Those types of things are subjective. And so we'll continue to do that. It won't be that we won't talk to them without putting down a check or an application. Not at all. If we have a good initial conversation and they feel like some of these things would be eligible and the project comes together, at that point we would formalize it a bit more.
Okay.
Why don't we do this then? You're coming, first reading ordinance August 20th. Is that before our next meeting is?
August 20th.
It would be that day.
August
Yep.
20th. Mm-hmm. Why don't you?
Just to give you a preview?
Yeah, give us a preview.
Sure. Okay.
If that'd be okay, that should be okay on our schedule, I believe. Yeah, just give us a preview.
Okay.
We don't care about the fee. That's the important thing anyway, but let's just have a little preview of this, for this deal.
Well, that makes us feel more special. We'll have a matinee, and then we'll have the main
That's
feature
right.
at night.
That's
How about
right.
that?
I have one other question, and then you can get out of here.
Okay.
What is and it's a unique question, what's the most, you've been around the country a little bit, looking at TIFs and different things. What's the most unique TIF, use of a TIF that you've seen?
Oh, boy.
You know,
Unique, maybe in the, let's say in a way that I wouldn't repeat or support.
Yeah, it doesn't have to be something that we would support, and probably wouldn't be, but some other idiot city has done.
you know, I heard of one, and I won't name the city.
Yeah, don't name the city.
But they TIFed an area about as big as they legally could to recruit one firm. And I think it affected their finances for the city, county, and school district for several years.
Several.
And we're talking, I think when Darren was talking 7- and 8-figure TIFs, it was clearly 8, if not 9-figure, what the sum was.
I forgot about the big picture and looked at the one shot.
Yeah.
Well, and it's just been fascinating, I think, to see how other cities have utilized them, and it's all over the place. You know, Rapid City is 80 or 90 some TIFs. Omaha, I think, was well over 100, if I remember right. But again, they're using them in a very different way than we are. Maybe they're using them for, you know, public infrastructure type investments that may or may not even be associated with an individual project, but and betting on the come in that area to create increment to pay for it. And that's where some cities, I think, get in trouble, is when they speculate by investing in sewer, water, and other utilities in an area, you know, 6 or even 7 figures, and then the development doesn't happen, you know, quickly enough to generate the increment to pay those bonds back. That's where they get in trouble.
Yeah.
So,
Okay, thank you, gentlemen.
thank you.
Okay, let's talk a little deer.
Do we need to have a motion to put this to the August 20th meeting or not? No?
No,
Okay.
we'll just invite them back.
Work.
Arden?
Thank you for inviting me today.
Introduce yourself for the record.
Yeah, Arden Peterson, Regional Supervisor for Game Fish and Parks. I'm here mostly to answer what questions I can of you today, but I'll go back a little bit and try to lay out some of the things that we're involved in and that what attracts deer to Sioux Falls. And I think that kind of looks at the big picture. With the unique green space that we have along the Big Sioux River in Sioux Falls, we have great habitat, great cover for deer with the trees and the grass and the private and public lands along the Big Sioux River. We have a great park system and great bike trail along which a lot of the deer live in Sioux Falls. Food and water and escape cover. We really don't have very much hunting right here in Sioux Falls. We do have a little bit of a limited hunt in the northeast part of the city, but there's no large predator population here, and really the only danger to deer is vehicles here in the city. We have a number of deer, I'm assuming, in the city. We don't track deer in the city, but I'm assuming there's some of the deer that live here in the city that never leave the city limits. There really isn't a reason for them to leave. I'll talk a little bit about what have we done to control deer. How our agency or my agency controls deer is through hunting seasons. And a few years ago, we started a hunting season here in Sioux Falls. Very limited, but it's provided a great recreational opportunity and also has, I don't know if it's so much reduced our population of deer in the city as much as it's kept it from expanding any more rapidly. But our major way that we control deer outside the city, if we have a high deer population, is through hunting seasons, whether it be our archery seasons, our muzzleloader seasons, or rifle seasons. And here in the city, we've now had seasons the last 3 years. This will be our 4th year that we're embarking on, and we've harvested approximately 60 deer in those 3 seasons. But it's very, very challenging to control deer without hunting seasons. And I look at our challenges ahead. How do we limit concentrations of deer? Possible expansion of hunting areas. That's pretty hard in the city. I'm not saying that we can't do that, but where we have the city season right now is an area that's doesn't have much human population. We don't have much interaction with people up in that area, so we're able to have that hunting season. And another possible way would be to consider a feeding ban. But that's really up to you as the city to decide. It's not really up to our agency, but it could help limit the concentration of deer in certain locations. As I look at the pros and cons of deer feeding or feeding of wildlife, there's not a lot of pros as you look at it from wildlife management perspective. There is wildlife viewing, and that's very important, especially very important for a lot of people that like to view for bird viewing. But it's also important for people that like to view wildlife, whether it's deer or turkeys or other big game animals in locations. But primarily here in Sioux Falls, it would be bird viewing and deer viewing. The cons is feeding does concentrate more animals. It could lead to possible disease transmission as you get more animals concentrated in an area. It could lead to more deer accidents, and it could lead to more landscape or crops or garden damage. So those are things that I look at as the possible pros and cons. But there are a number of cities across the country that have started bans on feeding wildlife, and most of them make an exception for people to continue to feed birds with maybe an elevated feeder or something. I know Rapid City has a feeding ban ordinance, and Pierre does, and there are other communities that do as well. But that's really up to you to decide, but I'd be willing to try to answer any questions that you may have.
Questions? Councilor Sagers.
Do we really have a problem here in Sioux Falls, from your point of view?
We as an agency took a few more calls from citizens of Sioux Falls, I'd say last year, than we had in the past. And so whether it's a problem to those people that perceive it to be a problem. And, I don't have the numbers, and I don't know if Mike would have the numbers on car deer accidents in the city, but it's kind of in the eye of the beholder. It seems like when you have these issues, and they have it in Rapid City, some people will be feeding deer or were feeding deer prior to their ordinance, and the neighbor next door was losing their shrubs and flowers and didn't care for it. So you got some people that really like to watch them, and some people that don't care for the damage that they do. It's hard to say what the problem is, but as I said before, I think our deer season up in the Northeast is probably keeping a few more deer from moving into the city. Whether it's keeping our deer population from growing anymore, I don't know. But I don't know whether it's something that we're going to be able to continue to live with as is. But I know that we fielded a few more calls last year, and I don't know if animal control fielded more calls from folks that were upset with concentrations of deer. I probably
Mike, do you
personally
have
took
those
about
numbers?
half dozen.
Sioux Falls Animal Control. I do not have the deer accident numbers with me tonight. I can get those to the council. I believe I may have presented some of those numbers previously. We don't see as many accidents in the same areas where we're receiving the complaints. The complaints are mostly generated in the 57th and Cliff area, Tomar area. We did have a few complaints that were in like the 41st and Southeastern Drive area. We didn't have a whole lot of complaints last year. They probably were up from the year before, but we do see people on both sides of the issue. I mean, we have people that want to feed the deer, want them in their yards, but we have people that are upset about the damage to their shrubs and trees that are in their yard. Actually have deer that are bedding down in their yards at night that are upset about the deer populations. As far as the car deer accidents, the majority of those still continue to occur in the Rice and northern 229 area, where we continue to conduct the hunt to try to manage the numbers up there.
Okay. Go ahead, Councilor Karski.
Two questions. Are there any current restrictions at a state level on, you know, like salt licks, that type of thing? What can be put out for deer?
There is a rule or a law that prohibits people from putting salt licks out, and there is also rules in place that prohibit people from baiting deer for hunting purposes.
Okay. And then the second question, are there any state laws regarding harassment of wildlife, deer, geese, turkeys, that type of thing? Could somebody get in trouble for chasing deer off their property?
There are laws that prohibit people from harassment of wildlife, but the enforcement of that would be looked at on a case-by-case situation. You know, if they were doing damage to their garden or their shrubs or whatever, people shooing them away or anything, that's not going to be a problem. People have the opportunity to protect their property.
Okay.
Else? Keith, could you give us a brief rundown of what we have on the books right now? And we'll have it all together in one spot, what we need for information, I think. And
as far as the city level, you mean?
yeah.
At the city level, the only animal feeding issues that we have regard waterfowl. That's just in specific areas. So presently right now, for any complaints that we have regarding deer feeding, the only thing that we've been able to rely on, if anything, was the state statute that Mr. Peterson referred to. And that only pertains if it's salt. So if it doesn't have any salt in it, if I understand it correctly, we cannot use that statute.
Okay. Thank you, gentlemen.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
You bet. Thank you. Okay. We're in a...
I guess,
Go ahead.
you know, for the sake of discussion, I don't know where we want to go with this. Councilor Aguilar, I hate to put her on the spot, but I don't know if she has some ideas or specific thoughts on what direction we could go with all this.
Councilor Sue Aguilar, representing the Southeast District. I have had a number of calls from constituents and even have had a few of late as far as deer feeling very comfortable in a woman's yard, and she was out there and the deer just laid down and
Took a nap.
yeah, so you know, the animals too, becoming that domesticated puts them in danger. But you know, I felt that it needed to come before this group because I had, you know, no ideas. I was aware that Sioux City had recently, back last fall, passed a law as far as deer feeding and also turkeys, I believe. And so I thought that land use was the appropriate venue to hash this out before taking it any further.
Yeah.
Again, for discussion, and interesting that Councilor Aguilar would say, you know, how the deer became comfortable around an individual. I can see a problem where deer start to view your yard as their yard, and there have been instances of deer attacking people. You know, you hate to make laws for the sake of telling people don't do things that you would hope that they wouldn't do, but at the same point, maybe it is something that we should talk about a little more, so I'm just going to bring it to that level. Do we want to discuss, you know, feeding wildlife other than, you know, songbirds in a bird feeder? I mean, how broad do we want to make this?
Yeah, exactly. Any thoughts, Councilor Sagers?
Well, from what has been said this afternoon, Sue mentioned, of course, an incident, and then asking other people, just doesn't seem like there's really a big issue right now.
Okay. I would tend to agree with Councilor Staggers. I guess it's going to get there. I think it's going to get there with the number of deer that we do have. But I don't think at this point that it's at a point where we need to establish a law or an ordinance, if you will, that says you can't feed, you can't do that. I think we do need to maybe let people know that it's probably not the wisest thing to feed the deer, because when you make them dependent, they're not going to be wild anymore, and they're probably not going to be able to survive. Although we've done such a great job in the city of Sioux Falls. I was out on the golf course the other day, and I looked down off of one of the holes I finished up on Prairie Green, and I looked down there, and there was a quarter mile of perfect refuge for deer. Just perfect place for them to live all year round. I mean, it wouldn't have been any better if there had been 10 miles outside of Sioux Falls. And if somebody was feeding them corn on the side, it would have been even better. It would have been a Shangri-La. And so I don't know what we can do about that when it does get to be the point that we are seeing them, you know, every day running across the interstate and running across the Cliff Avenue in Minnesota and all the streets that are down in that way. We're going to have to do something, but I hate to be too proactive, if you will, at this point. And I guess my vote at this point would be to note it, you know, put it in the tickler file for a year or two from now and see if we're still getting those kind of calls. And if we are, then maybe act on it at that point. Not forget it, but tickle it. Would that make sense?
Sounds good.
Okay.
Sure.
With that in mind, is there any other open discussion? Hearing none, I'll adjourn this meeting till the third week of October, the 20th. August. Or of October, how about August?